Hey, folks, how's it going? We are here ready to launch off another episode, and we have a very exciting guest lined up for us today. He's a cloud developer advocate at Google and the co host of the famous Kubernetes pod. I'm sure you have heard of it across social media, and if you're a part of the Kubernetes space. And he's also a CNCF ambassador. And this is a figure that we see talking at so many events around the world throughout the year. Welcome to the podcast, Abdel.
Hi, folks. Hi, how are you
Hi,
doing?
Dave. Yeah, we are doing great.
Awesome. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So we have a series of questions for you, and most of the questions are gonna have some takeaways for our listeners as well. So let's get started. Shamud can start firing right away.
Right.
Yeah. So can you tell me about your journey to become a cloud developer advocate at Google, and also what drove you to the cloud native ecosystem?
Oh, okay. That's okay. We are starting off strong. All right. So, I started my career in a very kind of atypical way. I have a master's in software engineering, but I never really worked as a software engineer. My first job out of university was an Android developer for like 6 months. I
Okay.
mean, this was my internship, but you can consider it a job because I was paid. And then right after that, I got hired by a company in my home country, Morocco, where I was a data center engineer. So it was a data center, right? And they needed somebody to do a little bit of everything. I think you can consider that what we today call DevOps. So a little bit of system administration, a little bit of development, a little bit of everything. So I did that for a while, I think 2 years and a half. Um, and then most of my work was focused on automation and infrastructure, so low level like compute, storage, networking stuff. And then 2013, I was hired at Google to join their data center. So Google has a lot of data center all over the world, and one of the biggest ones in Europe is in Belgium. So I joined that one for 4 years and kind of continued doing the same work. Infrastructure automation, debugging, troubleshooting, stuff like that. And 2017, I moved to cloud, and that's actually this was just by accident. But I am wearing a T-shirt from the from the team I used to work for. PSO stands for Professional Services Organization, and NE stands for North Europe. Because I moved to Sweden, so I was technically part of the Northern European region. And professional services inside Google is the consulting part of Google Cloud. So we have customers, and when customers come and buy Google Cloud, sometimes they say we want to work with actual people from Google to do the implementation, right? And so that kind of was my first journey toward cloud native, because I came in as an infrastructure specialist, but very quickly picked up Kubernetes. This was around 2017 when Kubernetes was 4 years old, 3 years old technically, and it did not scale beyond 5,000 nodes. And I don't remember which version it was. I have to do the math to figure out which version. Um, it might have been 116 maybe, or something like that, 116, 117. So I started working on a couple of projects that involved Kubernetes, because at the end of the day, Kubernetes is just automation on top of infrastructure. And if you are familiar with Linux, Kubernetes shouldn't be too difficult to understand. So did a couple of projects that all involved Kubernetes and some cloud native technologies, automation with Terraform, all the cool tools. And then 2022, I joined the advocacy team, where I am right now. So almost a year and a half, close to 2 years in October. Um, so yeah, that's how it started. I went to my first KubeCon in Copenhagen, 2018, I think. And since then, I've been to every single in-person KubeCon in Europe. I've never been to anywhere in the US. So I did Copenhagen in 2018. It was, I think, Barcelona 2019, Valencia in 2022, Amsterdam 2023, and Paris last year. And yeah, CNCF ambassador since last year, and the podcast also since last year. No, last 2022, 2 years ago. So yeah, that's kind of like the journey. It was a very fast journey, I guess.
Yeah, that's quite the journey, and I believe if there's someone out there who is qualified to talk about Kubernetes here with us, that has to be you. But yeah, just on something that you mentioned that about your previous roles at Google, including, I believe, sometime in data centers and professional services. So how did these experiences shape you in your approach to cloud and also cloud advocacy as a whole? Because that's what you do now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think so. I mean, when you work in data centers, you are working on low level infrastructure, right? So all the problems that you have to deal with when you are managing a high scale system, that's what mostly data centers have to deal with, right? Um, um, the concept of like distributed systems with like distributed systems that can fail at any moment in time, that's essentially core to what data centers do. It's true that I was more on the low level hardware side of it, but I was still involved in some automation and some troubleshooting. And doing low level distributed system is very interesting because at the scale at which Google operates, automation fails and breaks in so many interesting ways. And if you have an infrastructure as complex as the one that Google has, which is kind of what most cloud infrastructure looks like today, which is essentially layers and layers of abstractions on top of over layers of abstractions. Um, it's very interesting when just like you have a bug in one layer and it impacts the other layers in interesting ways, and you have to like kind of dig deep to troubleshoot and figure out what's wrong. So that kind of um, experience of dealing with high scale distributed systems. Plus, also the fact that at the scale at which Google operates, there is some very unconventional, not maybe not unconventional is the wrong word, but some very unique techniques. Like I can give you an example, like software defined network (SDN). That's just something that we've been talking about in the industry since the last 5 years. Google have been doing that for a very long time, right? For your audience, SDN is the concept where your network stack is split into control plane and data plane. So instead of having a switch or a router that has the switching plane, which is you can think about it as the data plane part of a switch or a router. Let's take a router. Router is a good example. So in the router, there are two components. There is the routing part, which is the data plane. That's where packets get routed, right? And then there is the control plane, which is where decisions are made. So when you configure a router, you configure the control plane, and the control plane configure the data plane for you. And the data plane will implement whatever policies the control plane tells it. In a traditional router, most of these two components are in the same box. In an SDN or software-defined network, you have a computer or a separate control plane doing all these routing decisions, right? Kind of similar to what Kubernetes does, right? Like the control plane programs the data plane, which is kind of the worker nodes, right? So SDN is something I was exposed to very early. The whole concept of observability at high scale, and then from that going into consulting, um, um, it helped a lot because you work with a mixed bag of customers. Some of them are pretty advanced, right? Like if you work with a startup, they are pretty advanced. They're pretty kind of like keen to try new technologies, keen to try the stuff that will make their life easier. That's actually very important. And if you work with traditional companies, they're more like, culturally, you have to convince them. There's like a lot of kind of convincing and talking and discussing and explaining. So, both these things taught me like what I think, in my opinion, what a developer advocate should have. Like you should have the technical side of things, right? Like you cannot advocate for things you don't understand. That's very important. Also, to a large extent, I think that developer advocacy is a lot of education. You need to be able to explain concepts in an easy way. So working with customers, explaining to customers taught me how to do that. And the third thing, which is important, is empathy. Like you work with customers and your goal is to try to solve their problems. So it's very important that you don't kind of like you don't try to feel or put yourself in a position where you are feeling some sort of superiority to them. You have to like be down to earth and be understandable and be kind of compassionate. And in advocacy, that's important because a lot of times, I mean, I can give you a simple example. Like I spend quite a lot of time on Stack Overflow trying to help people solve their problems because it's the right thing to do, and also because it helps me figure out where we might have gaps in terms of like content, right? Like, are we explaining things properly? Is our documentation clear? Can we make things clearer? And it's important, if you are doing that, not to like, comment on people questions with like, oh, you're stupid, you don't know what you're doing, but try to be compassionate and try to have empathy and try to understand that the person on the other side is also a human being trying to solve a problem, and kind of work with them to solve that problem. So yeah, I think that those kind of like various experiences allowed me to have this all these skills needed to be a developer advocate. Also, kind of public speaking is important, right? Like, as a developer advocate, you get to do a lot of conferences, as you mentioned. So yes, it's kind of like a mix of multiple things.
All
Gotcha.
right.
Gotcha. I
Yeah.
think, yeah, I
Yeah,
think
go
your
ahead.
example of how, mistreating or, what do you call, demotivating someone who's trying to learn resembles well with a meme that I've been seeing going around about the difference between developer conversations in two platforms. So I'm not going to tell names here, but yeah. Yeah. Chamal?
Yeah, so what I wanted to say is when dealing with customers, sometimes we have to put in their shoes to understand their problems, and also we can educate them really well. Okay,
Yes.
so yeah, so my next question is, can you share your thoughts on the current trends in Kubernetes adoption and any prediction you have for its the future?
Oh wow. Okay. uh, okay. I might be a little bit biased in the way I'm gonna answer this, but I think that's, and I'm hardly the only person thinking this way. But I think that I mean, adoption is pretty clear. There are quite a lot of reports you can read from the CNCF that comes out every year. The Cloud Native Compute Foundation, for those who doesn't know what it means, that's the foundation that is basically behind the Kubernetes project, or that is governing the Kubernetes project. Adoption is growing year over year, right? I mean, it's very interesting in the tech industry. If you go look at like read news, people might come out with like a mixed feeling in terms of how adoption is going, depending on what you read. You might either come out thinking, oh, the adoption is going very like growing very high, or that, oh, everybody's going back to doing their own data centers and going away from Kubernetes. So it depends on the source, right? So, but if we just look at numbers, like adoption is growing. That's a fact. Um, I think Kubernetes as a system is pretty complex. Everybody knows that, and it's not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve all the problems. So and also there is depending on the markets, depending on the country, there is probably some countries that still struggle just because there is a skill gap. There isn't enough qualified people to be able to like work on these complex systems, right? um, I think what's going to happen over time, and this is my prediction, is that Kubernetes will become a layer in a platform that people don't have to care about, right? You can think about it as Linux being a layer that no one cares about, right? Like, when you're using a cloud platform, you just assume that Linux is there, right? Like, it's you create a VM, it comes with an operating system. Maybe let's not say Linux, let's say operating system, right? Like, an operating system is just there, right? Like, you like today, hardly any cloud provider gives you a VM without an OS, because a VM without an OS is useless, right? You cannot do much with it. Um, so over time, I think Kubernetes will become just a layer that you use to automate your infrastructure, but you don't care too much about it, and you let the cloud provider deal with it. Now, having said that, the way, or the mentality, or the way you would use an operating system and the way you would use Kubernetes are completely different, right? And there are still some stuff that Kubernetes as a system cannot solve particularly well. Let's say, um, um, and so I mean, the very common example is running databases. Yes, you can run databases. There are caveats. There are things you have to be aware of. Or running ML and AI workloads. Yes, you can do that, but there are caveats as well, right? So I think, like, as we are progressing with the projects and as we are solving those like very unique use cases, we are getting closer and closer to that situation where Kubernetes will become just a layer that you don't have to care that it's even there. It just available for you. You have the API, and you interface or you interact with the API. The other the other thing that is still making Kubernetes not probably a developer friendly tool is the fact that it's YAML based, and a lot of people have a hate love relationship with YAML depending on who do you ask, right? So so that's also and there are companies there are tools and companies and open source projects that are working on trying to solve that problem. So I think that the last 10 years of Kubernetes have been all about solving the most common problems. And as we're going forward, we are probably going toward the direction where we solve developer experience or developer UX with Kubernetes. So making it more developer friendly, and also solving those like unique use cases.
Yeah, so like you said, Kubernetes is the hardest technology I ever learned, because I need to know about a lot of things. Like it has so many technical jargons, like ports, deployment, stateful states, so many things. Right away.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And these days, I don't think like Shamo is far beyond in his Kubernetes journey, and he's helping me adopt it as well these days. So he's a co-host and a teacher. But
Nice.
yeah, yeah. Moving ahead in with what we were talking about. So you were talking about how organizations could have shortcomings and have challenges adapting. So what are the most common challenges you see when an organization or an individual is trying to adopt Kubernetes, and what are your go-to methods to help address them? What do you have, sort of a template that you use whenever these issues come up, or like how do you approach it?
I mean, there is no such like a kind of a method fit all, because it always depends on the use cases. I think that there are a few things that you have to try to get people to understand. Um, just the mentality shift about the difference between imperative and declarative is quite high. Getting people to understand that Kubernetes is a declarative system, and that in a declarative system you don't tell the system what to do, you just declare what you want the system to achieve, right? So just that is already kind of like if you get to the point where people understand that, you're already far behind or far ahead of a lot of obstacles, right? And that comes with the fact that people have been used to scripting and writing chef and puppets and Ansible kind of like scripts, and using bash to automate things and stuff like that. That, like, if people come from this background, it's very hard for them to like get to the point to understand that, oh, you just write a YAML file and then things happen. And that's not because it's hard to understand the concept. I think it's because in a declarative environment, a lot of the magic behind, if you want to call it magic between codes, feels too magical to people, and it feels like they are losing control because they don't understand how it works, right? So you have to get people to a point where they can understand how things works, barely, to be able to be confident that it's okay. It's like, it's fine if you don't understand it completely. You understand the basics, and that's all you need to know, right? So that's already like one step ahead. And this applies to, because that's the thing also with one of the things also with Kubernetes is, like, in traditional infrastructure management, you have multiple personas, right? You have your infrastructure people, and then you have your application developers, and then you have your networking people, and then you have your security people. And all these people use different tools to achieve their job or to do their work, right? In Kubernetes, everybody is using the same tool, which is the API, right? So trying to get everybody to kind of like consolidate their understanding across one single API that solves all these issues. It solves network programming, it solves security programming, but also deployments and management of application lifecycles. That's already a hard problem to solve. And if you're able to get an organization to that level, that's already good enough, right? So that's a good starting point. Let's just put it this way. The second thing also is to try to explain to people that it's not a silver bullet. It's not a one tool fit all, right? Like, there are use cases where Kubernetes doesn't work, and you shouldn't try to make it work. So getting people to understand that difference between, like the level of balance, because otherwise, in my experience, people will just try to throw everything in Kubernetes and just hope it works, right? And so yeah, there is no single template. It really depends. It's kind of painful sometimes because you have to do it over and over again with customers and organizations. And at this stage in my job, I don't really have to deal with kind of organizations at this level anymore, because I don't really work with customers directly anymore. Or if I get to work with customers, they're already mature and they already have like problems that they know and they need help with. But yeah, if you're listening to this, I think like any new technology adoption, things take time, and there will be people who are hesitant, and you just need to like help them step by step, basically.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So that's quite the roundup of Kubernetes. And now we're going to move away from Kubernetes for a slight bit of time. We'll definitely get back to it later
Sure.
on in this. But Shamod has some exciting questions for you in terms of the work that you have been doing in the community, and mainly to start with podcasts. And I'm sure you might have some tips and tricks for us as well.
Of course.
So Shamod, take it away.
Yeah. So, as a host of the Kubernetes podcast from the Google, what are some of the most memorable episode or interviews you have been part of?
Oh, without a doubt, the interview I did with Phil Estates around Container D. I don't remember the episode number. So Container D, Phil Estates, go listen to it. It might be 217, maybe. I might be wrong.
We'll link it in the show notes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So just a little bit of background. Phil Estates is a principal engineer at AWS, but before that, he have been working at IBM for 20 years, 20 plus years, right? Started from Linux, and then went to cloud, and then eventually Containerd. And Containerd is a container runtime, right? So it was created when this thing called container. This no. So there is like a container initiative that was there was an initiative created by multiple companies to try to standardize how containers are built and run. And in that project, the runtime part of Docker was donated, and then there was an alternative created called Containerd, which is essentially just the runtime, just the part of Docker that runs containers. And today, Containerd is becoming the default or the de facto in Kubernetes. Kubernetes open source doesn't support Docker anymore, or not by default. It supports something called the CRI, the Container Runtime Interface. So any container runtime that implements that interface would work with Kubernetes, and Containerd is one of them. But Containerd itself is built to be more like a generic container runtime, and also process management tool. If you want, you can today do WASM inside Containerd. You can do a lot of things. The reason why that conversation was memorable is because I know Phil for a very long time. We met in other circumstances, and then when we wanted to talk about Containerd, the conversation started with like a standard interview, the way we do it, like tell us about yourself, etc., and turned into more like a travel back in history or a memory line from how it started, because Phil have been involved in all these like projects in the life cycle of all of this, starting from Kubernetes and before Kubernetes. So it felt more like a fireside chat, if you want, like two people talking about history, and more kind of Phil explaining to me the history of things, and me kind of like being fascinated with how much he knows and how much he have been involved with, and how much the technology have evolved over time. So by far, that's my most memorable episode.
Yeah. So I just checked my podcast. I think I have listened to that podcast. So I remember in that there you discuss about how team came up with the to develop the container D platform,
Yes.
and how they take decisions. Yeah,
Yes.
that's really interesting.
It was
Yeah.
episode 208. I was wrong with the number. So 208. Well, we'll leave a link in the show notes.
How many episodes
Yeah.
are you in now? Like What's the
We
current
are
number?
a 226, if I'm not mistaken, and we are pushing 227 tomorrow. At the date of
Okay,
or recording this episode, tomorrow is the 10 years anniversary of Kubernetes, right? So we're pushing
correct.
our 10 years anniversary special, and I'm not gonna spoil who the guests are, but it's awesome.
Yeah. Anyway, this will come out after that, so you can.
Okay, so if it comes
Uh,
after that, then maybe it would have been
uh,
already published, and you should go listen to it.
exactly. Yeah. But yeah, so as the host, how do you necessarily decide the topics, the guests? Like, there's so many people doing wonderful stuff in this space, and how do you decide which one to bring on, and how what do you talk with each person? Like, what have you learned from engaging with the community through the podcast and as the host of this podcast?
Yeah, it's interesting. The podcast today is called the Kubernetes podcast, but we really rarely do anything Kubernetes specific. I mean, I think the right name should be Kubernetes and Cloud Native podcast, right? Because we do a little bit more with Cloud Native. So we have few episodes that are the regular episodes, we call them, and those are interviewing the Kubernetes release leads. So for every new version of Kubernetes, there is a release lead, and then we have an interview with that release lead. So we did since we started. That's a tradition that the podcast had since the beginning, and we just can continue with the tradition. So that's basically every 4 months, because there is a release every 4 months, right? So that makes it 3 episodes per year. Um, the other type of episodes we started doing when we took over the podcast, and that's me and Kaslin's kind of touch, is the KubeCon coverage. Right, we go to KubeCon, we ask people on the floor about their impression of the conference, and we put that together in an episode. So that's kind of another special kind of type of episodes. The rest is pretty much whatever we want to do. To be honest, we have like full kind of editorial freedom in terms of what do we want to do on the podcast. Um, Typically it's whatever topic that is either haven't been touched before, or something that had a major change, or something that is kind of obscure and unique and no one is talking about it. I can give you an example. We did this episode with open feature, which technically is not even related to containers. It's like a go. It's a new project within the cncf, which is about feature flags. So that has nothing technically to do with Kubernetes or containers or anything like that, but it's a cloud native tool. And I was just curious about it, and we reached out to the maintainers, and they said yes, and we did it, right. We also sometimes, some articles gets published about some ongoing, problems or some ongoing debates, and that also sometimes makes it a good kind of idea to bring somebody to talk about that. I'm just talking here about the when there was this issue of like stale reads in etcd. We did an episode about that, talk about it. When etcd became a sig, for the people who doesn't know, etcd, which is the database for Kubernetes, that was a standalone project within the cncf. It was a graduated project, but then they turned it into a sig, which is a special interest group within the Kubernetes project. And that's a key difference, because when a project is standalone, it has a different governance model than when it's part of the Kubernetes overall project as a sub project, if you want. We talked about that too with two of the kind of tech leads for etcd. So it's kind of like mixed bag of whatever we want to do. And at this stage, like the show is so popular that bringing new guests is not an issue. So typically when we reach out to new guests, they say yes, they want to be on the show. And yeah, right now we're in the middle of doing our 4 part special 10 years anniversary episodes, right? So we decided that for the month of June, for the 10 years anniversary of Kubernetes, we're going to do 4 special episodes, which are coming out almost every week. So we already published one, we're publishing another one this week, which is the week of the anniversary, and then we're doing 2 more in June, and then we will go back to our kind of regular release schedule, which is every 2 weeks.
Gotcha. I think it's really cool that you mentioned the tradition of having a talk with this release lead, because we actually got this idea to host this while hosting Kat from the latest release team. Shout out to Kat.
Yes.
But yeah, we actually got this idea while doing that, so it's pretty cool that you came on and mentioned that y'all have the tradition to do the same. Um, but yeah, Shamod,
Yeah. So, what role do you see podcasts and other forms of media playing in the education and growth of Kubernetes community? Actually, cloud native community.
yeah,
Um,
and this whole space, to be honest, yeah.
yeah, I think podcasts are interesting in the sense that so podcasts are not always only about education, right? They are also about opinions and what people think about stuff, right? And if you really listen to our episodes, we're not really only talking about how stuff works, but we're talking about how people think about how stuff works, or how people think about how stuff should work, right? So that's interesting. um I think there are a lot of people doing all sorts of like YouTube content around the cloud native space that are doing really good job. I'm here talking about like Victor from Upbound, Siam from Sivo Cloud. What's the name of the other developer advocate in Sivo? I forgot his name. Um, uh, uh,
Kunal?
Kunar, thank you. I was about to say Kunar also. There are a lot of people doing all sorts of like content to teach people this kind of concepts. I think there is place for everything. There is place for basic concepts like one-on-one level content. There is place for advanced content. There is place for more discussions, which I think podcasts are a better fit for that. So I think generally speaking, all content is good. I feel like at this stage the it's getting a little bit saturated, and if people are trying to get into this, they have to either try to bring a new angle to it, or the other thing which I've seen a lot of people doing is doing it in a different language, right? Because so far all the content is primarily English or primarily dominated by English content, and I know that some people have started, like I think Siam have started doing some stuff in Indian, and
Indie, yeah.
or Hindi, sorry, Hindi, and I've seen content in Arabic as well. So there are people doing podcasts in French. So that makes kind of things easier to understand for people who are not like primarily or like English speakers primarily. So I think if you're somebody's trying to jump on this, maybe either finding a different angle or finding a different way of doing it, or a different format, right? Like we are doing 45 minutes to 1 hour format, maybe shorter, maybe longer. I don't know. Like there are quite a lot of other ways you can do it. But generally speaking, to answer your question, yes, I think content of all levels is good. And all of this helps promote and help people kind of understand and get to understand stuff. So
Gotcha, gotcha. So moving away from content for a bit, I've been a follower of your Twitter account for a while now, and it's mostly about you talking at conferences around the world, and of course running when you're in town for a conference. So, big fan of the tweets, but about
thank
that.
you.
So, yeah, considering the numerous amounts of conferences that you speak at, what tips and tricks do you have for getting a Kubernetes related talk accepted at a conference? Because it's more often than not technically explaining a technical concept or a topic to a diverse audience. So, any tips on writing an effective proposal as well as effectively communicating these technical ideas to a diverse audience?
Yeah, I think the first tip is don't use ChatGPT. Or don't just use
Oh,
ChatGPT, like, or at least if you do, try to edit the abstract before you send it to a conference. Um, I find it at this stage, I find it a little bit not difficult, but I find it not very interesting for me personally to just do like basic one-on-one Kubernetes content anymore, because there is probably like so many of that already available, and some conferences are already fed up with just like one-on-one content, especially if the conference is not primarily about Kubernetes, right? Um, so these days I find myself doing kind of two type of things, or maybe three types of talks, right? Let's say this way. Either I do talks where I kind of like talk about a specific aspect of Kubernetes, a specific project under the Kubernetes umbrella, and I talk about what's new with this project. Like I did a talk about what's new with the Gateway API, right? Which I did a couple of times, and I'm gonna do one in I think KCD. I don't remember which one. KCD. One of the KCDs coming. So I don't know. Sorry, a meetup. I'm doing a meetup in Denmark, and I'm talking about what's new in the Kubernetes API, in the Gateway API, and that's more because I'm involved with the Gateway API. So that's more kind of keeping people updated about the progress of that API, because it's one of the important APIs within Kubernetes. The other thing is taking concepts that are not necessarily Kubernetes specific, but try to find the Kubernetes angle to them. The example are things like software supply chain security in general, uh, um, uh, best practices for deploying apps in general, CI/CD, stuff like that. And the third thing would be anything that is um, a topic that is not primarily Kubernetes, but Kubernetes is just one of the deployment way of deploying it. So examples are things like AI in Kubernetes. That's just an example, right? AI ML in Kubernetes, generally speaking, there is this very popular framework called Ray. So I did spoke about Ray a couple of times. Since in Europe there is actually quite a lot of Java specific conferences. So now what I'm doing is I'm proposing to those conferences, because I know that even if you're a Java developer, you are most probably faced with the challenge that you have to run your application on Kubernetes. And what I do is I bring the angle of like, okay, what are the best practices of running a Java app on Kubernetes, considering all the I don't call them limitations, but the fact that Java was not designed for Kubernetes to start with, but it's being optimized over time, and I am looking at those optimizations and talking about that. So I think to answer your question, it doesn't have to necessarily to be just about Kubernetes, because maybe, again, as I said earlier, it's too complex for developers to understand, and it's not a developer friendly tool. So going to developer conferences talking about Kubernetes, not very interesting. But talking about it from the perspective of either how to use it for solving very specific problems like AI or Java or whatever, or talking about some subset of the project that is interesting to a subset of the audience of that conference is kind of like the two things I try to do.
Gotcha. I think being to so many KCDs that you forget which one is coming up next is the kind of problem that I want to have in my life. But yeah,
this year is the particular is an exceptional year. I'm doing a lot of them. Yes, last year I only did one, which was KCD Munich. But this year I think I'm doing 3 or 4, so that's why I was like, I forgot.
I think Chamod and I are gonna work hard to make sure that we add one more to your list.
Hopefully, yes. I'm trying to come to KubeCon India. We'll see. I hope I can make it.
It's a short flight from India, so let's.
That's what I'm saying. Yes, if I'm gonna be in the region, why not?
Exactly. But yeah, just a follow-up question. So you have an active role at Google where you play a big part in the advocacy team. So how much of influence do you think this plays in the type of proposals that you submit and and your talks? Is this something that you're allowed to answer?
Yes, I can.
Gonna have to bleep this out?
Yes, no, I can. I think, well, that's a very good question. I think it depends who do you ask, right? I think for some conferences, they probably accept. I think at this stage, because I've been doing this for quite some time, I think it's more that people know you rather than they know who do you work with, right? The fact that I work with Google or not Google doesn't probably matter for a lot of people. It probably helps because a lot of times the main challenge is that conferences cannot pay for your travel. And if you work for an employer who can support you financially to travel somewhere, that helps, right? But I think that people don't really care too much about who you are affiliated with as a company. They care more about who you are and the quality of content you're able to deliver, right? Because when you're on stage, your employer is not important. It's you. People come to listen to you, right? The second thing I think is sometimes it's hard because of course I work for Google, so I can only talk about the Google angle, and the Google angle is completely different than a different company, than a different community. So sometimes I'm asked to come talk about something, but they would ask me like, hey, can you please not talk about anything specific you do on Google Cloud, but talk about generic stuff, which I can do, right? So I think the answer to your question is it depends. It helps probably a little bit, but I think whether I work for Google or work for a different company, it probably wouldn't make that much of a difference in terms of where I get accepted and how many conferences I can do.
Gotcha.
So yeah.
Gotcha. Shaman?
Yeah. So, what are some of your personal favorite tools or features within the cloud native ecosystem that you find particularly useful and exciting?
Oh, that's a very hard question to answer. I'm a big fan of Istio. I know that a lot of people have a lot of beef with it. I think the project is great and it's making a lot of progress towards solving some of the challenges it has. I am a big fan of the Gateway API, of course. Again, a lot of people have a lot of opinions about it, but I think it's moving in the right direction. Um, I'm a big fan of just very simple command line tools. kubectl has a plugin manager, and within the plugin manager, you can install tons of plugins to make your life easier, like kubectl, kubectx, kubeNS. There's a lot of plugins that are like super cool. What else? I'm a big fan of Kiali, the dashboard for service mesh. It's great. Prometheus and Grafana, of course, they're super cool. And yeah, these are mostly the tools I work with. I don't really do anything too fancy. And yeah, I'm a big fan of KubeRay just because I started working on it recently, and I think it's a really cool tool for doing distributed compute on top of Kubernetes. The dashboard KubeRay comes with is amazing. So yeah, that's mostly what I kind of like the tools I kind of use day to day.
Oh,
Gotcha. I
and
think it's
yeah,
funny that you, yeah, mention Istio because Shamud has been trying it over the past 2 weeks, and he has absolutely fallen in love with it. There are random screenshots of workflows he sends me, and he's like, "You should try it out. You should try it out." So
It's really cool.
I guess,
yeah.
yeah,
So,
I guess it's fine.
actually, yeah, I didn't know there is a package manager for Kubernetes, like we mentioned earlier.
For CLI. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
I think it's called I think it's called Crew. Hold on, let me.
yeah, yeah. Crew. Yeah, I
Yeah,
find
Crew.
out.
Yeah. It's under the kubectl, and there's like 250 kubectl. There is like 250 plugins in it. So there are a lot of
Yeah, that's
plugins like one of my favorite plugin, and I forgot its name, is a plugin that can clean the output. So when you do a kubectl
Oh,
get
okay.
something or a kubectl
mhm.
describe, it doesn't like just prompt you all these like very long
Yeah,
output.
yeah,
It can
yeah.
like clear it and only show you the important stuff.
So does the output come and then it's cleaned, or does it come
Yes.
clean?
No. It comes and then it pipes it through the tool, and then it gives you
Mhm.
like a clean
Okay,
output. Yeah.
Wow,
that's
it's
pretty cool.
so interesting.
You
Yeah,
learn something every day. Yeah.
yeah.
I forgot its
Um,
name. I think it's I forgot the name. There is one also that is called KTOP. If you are familiar with HTOP on Linux, where you can like with
oh yeah,
HTOP you can get like top processes running, and there is
dashboard.
like
Yeah.
there is KTOP, which gives you basically the top pods in terms of like a resource conception. So
Yeah.
okay, so there is one called CLog, which colorize outputs, so it puts colors. And then the other clean one, I don't remember what it's called, but you'll find it. Just look at the thing.
Oh
Again,
my
we'll
god.
include it in the show notes.
Yeah.
Um,
So
but
yeah,
yeah,
so when we look at the Kubernetes landscape, there are so many technologies and rapid development in the cloud native space. So what resources do you recommend for others?
For like learning.
Yeah,
no, to
learning
keep
and
up.
getting things
Yeah,
wrong.
yeah,
Yeah. For
yeah.
an example, we just get to know new stuff from you.
Oh, I mean that's a very good question. I think it comes through tinkering. I don't think I follow any particular resources to keep up to date. I just like to tinker, and I spend a lot of time on the command line, so that's how I find things. Um, Stack Overflow, in my opinion, is a great way to learn. If you answer somebody else's question, means you learned something. That's a great place to start. Um, the CNCF blog and Kubernetes blog are pretty good. The Slack channel of Kubernetes is also pretty good. If you are starting, the in my opinion, the best combination, Kubernetes the hard way plus Kubernetes up and running, the best
Mm.
combo for learning
Seriously, I don't.
Kubernetes. If you have no idea, from Kelsey Hightower, and the book is from Kelsey Hightower, Joe Beda, and somebody else. I forgot the name. Um, but yeah, these are my tips. I really don't follow anything in particular. I just tinker with things.
Gotcha. Wait, I think it the space is very complicated and there's a lot of learning to do. So it's quite easy for folks to get lost, and being unable to keep up with it. So, what advice would you give to someone just starting in their journey in the space? the cloud native space, or and they want to ultimately end up in a role like a community advocate or somewhere where they get to teach others. So
I mean, there is no such. I mean, there is no kind of single advice. Just get started. Pick whatever you want to learn and learn it. Like, don't wait for people to show you things. No one pretty much has time for any of this stuff, I guess. Like, find whatever resource you feel familiar with, or you feel kind of comfortable with, and use that to learn stuff. The community is very welcoming. People are really nice. Feel free to ask questions on Slack or on Stack Overflow or anywhere you feel comfortable interacting with people. And yeah, I mean, just get started. That's, I think, my advice. Like, don't wait to find the perfect way to start, I would say.
Gotcha. So coming back to, these are just some quick fire questions that I personally came up with, like, while you were talking. So one more thing about how you showed the importance of ultimately the person talking at the conference and not the company you represent or where you're from or what you do. So how much of a role do you think a personal brand has in this space, and especially in this day and age where social media and everything is very much a thing?
A lot. I think I think that people ultimately care about who you are and not who do you represent, right? By that I mean, if you are a horrible person, if you are not a nice, great, helpful person, then people will just not like you and probably not listen to you and not follow you, right? So so I think like trying to keep like trying to work on your personal branding is good, but also what I mean by that is like, be genuine, just be yourself, share the stuff that truly excites you and that truly you care about, and at the same time try to be helpful, try to be nice, try to be a decent person. um, um, that's like, this is for me what personal brand means. It doesn't mean that you need to hire an agency to help you with your social media. Like, I have no one hiring. Like, I do my social media myself, right? I truly think about it as I share things that excites me, things that I like. I share things from my culture because I think that's important also, because you represent a culture, and I think you represent more a culture than a company, really. um so, and also I think that you yeah, it's a combination of all these things, and you need to be genuine and nice and helpful as much as possible, and of course be a little bit opinionated, because that's what people expect.
Yeah, I think that I think we should forget the Kubernetes part and take that as just generally good life advice. To be
Yes.
nice and to be yourself. Exactly. So just one last question that I'm going to fire at you. I'm hoping to make this a tradition and get the answer from everyone that comes on in the future. But
Sure.
I want one controversially hot take about Kubernetes from you.
Oh, very good one. Controversial hot take. I am gonna say the Ingress API is a horrible API. We should all move to the gateway one. It served us
Okay.
well
That's
for
true.
10 years. I think it's the time we stop talking about it and move to the next one. And it's time for all the cloud providers to start working on integration toward the new API.
I think I gave you space to let out some venting when you
Yes,
had to
yes.
do
I hate the Ingress API. So
All right, that's a perfect place to end things. Thank you so much, Abdel, for taking time out of your schedule to come join us today. And we will be linking Abdel's socials that we mentioned in the show notes as well. So thank you very much, folks. Thank you, Abdel, for joining. That's been it. See you next time.
thank you, folks. Thanks for having me.